following video is part of my practical TypeScript course. And if you wish to enroll in the full course, please navigate to Coding Addict.io. Again, the URL is Coding Addict.io, or you can utilize the link provided in description. Okay, and up next, let's discuss tuple or tuple in TypeScript, which is a special type since we don't have it in JavaScript. And essentially, it allows us to set up an array with fixed length and ordered with fixed type. In other words, it's super useful when we want to group different types of values together. So for example, I have a let person. Now this is an array, and here I have string of John and then number of 25. I can set the type in such a way where I go with my array and then I provide those values. So in this case, I'm going to go with string and number. So now this value is fixed. So if I'm going to try to add something else like hello, TypeScript is going to complain if the types are not going to match. If, for example, I do decide to place 25 over here, TypeScript also is going to complain. So not only we have fixed length, but also we right away set up the fixed types. So now this value can be only the string and number. Now there is a gotcha, something I'm going to cover in a second, but for now, let's just focus on this, that yes, it's going to be John and it's going to be 25. Now you're not limited to only two values over here. You can set up as many as you want. And for example, you can go here with number and number. I mean, that's also an option. Let's say you don't want to have just an array of numbers, but you want to have an array with fixed amount of numbers. So let me just go here. Let's say with date. So in this case, it's going to be number, number, and number. And then depending where you live, either you'll pass in the month or the day. So let's say I'm going to go with 12, then 17, and then we're going to go with 2001. So notice now this is a fixed array with number, number, number. So again, if we make any changes, TypeScript will complain about it. Now it's useful if, let's say, we want to return something from the function. Let me go with function get person, and we're not going to provide any parameters. I'm just going to say that, yeah, this function is going to return an array with such types. So string and number. So now let's set up the function body where we want to go with our array. We want to pass in John, and we're going to go with our 25. So now if we have random person now, and that one is equal to a get person, we invoke it. If we log random person and then 0, copy and paste, and 1 in a console, we should have both of those values. Now, like I mentioned, the gotcha here is that even though when we're hard coding these values, TypeScript is going to complain unless we provide over here this read only, we can actually add items or remove items from our particular array. So how is that going to look like? Well, let's say if I go with date.push, I can add the values, and TypeScript actually is not going to complain about it. Now, it complains because it's not a number, right? So it says, well, it's not a number, but if I change this to my 34, everything is going to be fine. So I can set up multiple instances, and now if I log the date, check it out. It's probably not something that we expected. Now, the workaround is to provide this read-only over here. So in this case, I cannot do that. So once we add this read-only, we cannot use anymore the push pop or whatever methods. That's something to keep in mind. Now, lastly, I also want to mention that we can use the optional parameters as well. So let's say if I'm going to create a new instance and I'm going to call this Susan. So I'm going to go with my tuple We're going to set up a string number. And in here, I'm just going to go with my optional parameter. Once I set it equal to my function, notice I can just provide the string and basically I'm good to go. TypeScript is not complaining. This should do it for tuples in TypeScript. And up next, we're going to discuss enums in TypeScript. Okay, and up next, let's discuss enums in TypeScript. Again, something we don't have in JavaScript. And essentially, enums allow us to define a set of named constants. The syntax is following. We want to go with keyword enum. Then let's come up with a name. In my case, I'm going to go with server response status, since we'll have a little bit of functionality. So we're going to go with response status. Then we want to go with the curlies, and this is totally up to you. You can go all lowercase, you can capitalize the first letter, or you can go all uppercase. Totally up to you. We just need to provide over here the values. And in a second, I'll show you what this actually results to. So first one is going to be success and then the error. Now we can add more, but for our example, we really don't need it. Then let's set up the interface. In this case, I'm going to call this server response. And then the first property, result, actually is going to be type of enum. So let's set it equal to server response status. And then another one is going to be a data. And this will be an array of strings. So now let's set up a function get server response, which actually is going to return this interface. So we go here with function get server response. Let's invoke that. As far as the return type, let's set up the server response. So this is equal right now to our interface. And then inside of the function body, we want to go with result. And now, since this is type enum over here, this is what we want to use. So we'll go over here with server response status. And notice we either have error or success. Again, you can use enum if you want to store some constants and then later on use it in your project. So now in this case, we only can provide success or the error. So let me type this one, and then in order to match our interface, I'll provide data as well. I'll say first item, then comma, and we're going to go with second item. Now I do need to add a comma over here. We do want to invoke it and set it equal to response. Const response is equal to our get server response. Let's invoke this function over here. And let's set up the type, what we're expecting. So we're going to look for our interface. And then let's also log the response, just because I want to show you the potential values we can set up over here. So at the moment we have success and error. And by default, they actually get the numbers starting with 0. And I'll show you what I mean in a second. So first, let me just log the response. And notice how the result is 0. Now, why is that? Well, because if we go up over here and we log server response status, we'll see that we have right now the success and error, and the values are 0 and 1. So it starts with 0, then 1, and then pretty much the more values you add, well, the more numbers you're going to have. Now, don't be surprised if you see quite a few values in a console. Essentially, at the moment, we have 4 of them. This is something we're going to discuss in the upcoming video. For now, I just want to showcase that even by default, you get those values starting with 0. So 0, 1, 2, 3, and whatever. You can also reassign them. So for example, I can say that success is going to be equal to a 500, or I'm sorry, 200, and error is going to be equal to 500. Or I can mix and match. I can say that, yeah, error is actually going to be equal to this string. This also is valid. And again, the main point is that now we have over here this constant, which we can use all throughout our project, instead of trying to make sure that we type the string or the number correctly. Okay, and up next, let's take a look at the gotcha with enums, which is the fact that when you have number values, it's actually going to do the reverse mapping. And remember, it is the default. So if we don't provide anything, we will get that reverse mapping. For example, if I provide over here 200 and 500, if I navigate to the browser, again, I have more values over here in this object. So not only error and success, but I also have this reverse where number is actually a property, and then whatever is my constant name is set as value. Now, why do we care? Well, because let's say we want to iterate over the values. In JavaScript, we have object.values, and then we pass in the object. Now, in this case, we'll pass in the enum, and you'll see that everything is going to work, but it's going to depend what kind of value we have over here. If we have a number, we'll have to do an extra check. So let's go here with object.values. Then let's provide server response status. And we're going to go with for each. So we're iterating over. Now I want to grab every value and we'll just log it. And again, since I have the number values, I have this reverse mapping. So now not only I have the number value, I also have this success and error. And it's not going to be the case if, let's say, we're going to go here with success and in here error. Again, something valid that you might set up in your code. Now everything is correct. Now we're only accessing that string. So if we have numbers, which again is the default setup. So again, let me set it up here as 200, just so we're on the same page. The solution over here is just to add another type guard. So if I only want to access the values, they are type what? Their number. So this was going to be a string. And therefore in here we'll say if type of and value, that was the name of my parameter. If it's equal to a number, well, then I want to log it or do some kind of functionality. In this case, just log. So we're going to go with console log and we'll log the value. So now we correctly just access those number values. Now, another place where we need to be careful is when we're setting up the value. So notice something interesting. If I have an enum, I have a constant over here, and the value is number, then later when I set up this enum as my type, I can still use the good old number. So this is going to work because again, TypeScript is doing that reverse mapping. However, if you have an enum where the constant value is actually a string, this is not going to fly. So just to showcase that, I think I'll comment this one out. So if I have here 200 and 500, if I set up over here this result to be equal to my enum, I can go to my server response, and this is going to work. So TypeScript is not going to complain about it. And I can see that my code runs and everything is awesome. However, if again, and I promised for the last time, or we'll change it around, we go with success and error, this is not going to fly. If we navigate back to our get server response and try to provide the string value. As you can see right now, TypeScript is complaining. So we cannot assign string to a type enum. However, when we use the number value, it's going to work because there is this reverse mapping. Hopefully that's clear. And now we're ready to move on to the next topic. Okay, and now let's work on our next challenge where we want to define a enum with the constants of admin, manager, and employee. Define the type alias named user. And in there, we'll set up the ID, property name, as well as the role. And the role is going to be equal to our enum. And also we'll set up the contact, which is going to be a tuple with two elements, the email, which is a string, as well as the phone. Then we'll set up a function by the name of create user, which will take in the user object as a parameter and return the user object. And then at the very end, we'll call the user object, provide the object, and we'll create the instance. So in the tutorial, I think I want to start by defining that enum here. Let's call this user role. Let me set up my constants here. And I think I'm going to rely on those default values. So 0, 1, 2, and I guess in this case, that's going to be it. Only going to be 0 and 1, 2. Then we also want to go with employee. After that, let's set up that type alias. In this case, user. Here, one by one, let's set up those properties. ID is equal to a number. Then we also have name is equal to string. We're going to go with the role. And in this case, it's going to be equal to a user role. So one of our 3 constants. And then we also want to go with contact and set this one up as string and string. We have create user function. So let's set it up over here. Create user. And this one is looking for a user parameter, which is going to be type user. Same deal over here. We're going to go with user. And from the function, we'll return the user. And the last step is to create the instance. So let's go with the user, which will be type user. Let's call create user. And now let's provide the values. ID, name, John Doe. Then also we'll have a role. And since we're using our enum, we're just going to set it equal to user role, then dot, and one of the values. In my case, I think I'm going to go with admin one. And then at the very end, we also have the contact. I want to set it equal to our array. And let's just provide some values. Gmail.com, comma, and then we're going to go with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, 8, 9. At the very end, let's just log it, and pretty sure everything's going to be correct. Yep. Looks like I have the correct value. And with this in place, we're ready to move on to the next topic. And up next, let's cover type assertion, which is a way to tell the browser what type an existing variable is. And this is especially useful when we know more about the type than the TypeScript does. As a side note, it's very handy with DOM elements. So if these examples don't seem that convincing, in the later sections, we will cover different examples as well. So let's imagine the scenario. We have a variable, and I'm going to go with some value. And for some reason, type is any. Now, as far as the value, I'll set this up as a string. So this is a string. And then in the next line, I want to get the string length, which actually is going to be a number. So in here, let's set it up. Type is going to be equal to a number. And now I want to go with dot length, but I want to assert to a TypeScript that actually this is a string. So I'll say some value, not just any type. I'll say as string. So the keyword we're looking for is this as. That's the assertion where we tell TypeScript that, yeah, I know that maybe this is not something you expect, but I know more. And I know that this is the specific type. This is also something that we can use, for example, with the JSON parse, because it returns any. So let's say we have a type bird. Now this type bird only has a name, and we'll set it equal to a string. Now it looks like I have a typo over here, so let me set it properly. And now I'll set up 2 JSON strings, and we'll run parse. Now in order to speed this up, I will grab those values from the README over here. So basically we have bird string and a dog string. We want to set it up over here. And now again, once we'll run JSON parse, you'll see that type actually is any. So let's say I have a bird object, and that one is equal to JSON, then parse, and now I'll pass in my bird string. So again, let me copy and paste, and let me set up one for the dog. And as we hover over, like I said, type is any. But I don't want type to be any. I actually want this to be a type bird. So if we create an instance or any other functionality, and we set it equal to a bird object, instead of just leaving it as type any, I can go with as and then my type. Because I clearly know that, yeah, maybe I'm getting this back as type any, but I know that the signature matches whatever I have here for the type bird. Now, please be careful. You can also do something like this, where you can set up the dog to be a bird. And most likely, that's not the behavior you want. So if I go over here with not bird object, I'm going to go with a dog object, and I'll set it equal to a bird. I will be able to look for dog.name. But if we take a look at the dog string, it doesn't have that property. So it has the breed. So if we go here with log and we type bird name, and as I said, for some reason it's complaining, it says cannot find bird. And yep, it's because for some reason I named it bed. So let me go here with bird and also a dog. Notice how TypeScript is not complaining because I made a type assertion that yes, this will be type bird, even though we can clearly see that it's actually type dog. Now, we don't have the type yet, but you get the point. So if I navigate right out of the browser, notice how I will get this unexpected undefined at runtime. And at the very end, let me just show you a use case that I just encountered when I was working on my next JS project. So in there was a enum, and I believe the name was status. Don't quote me on that. And there were more values, but I'm just going to set up 2 so we don't have to spend all day typing. And essentially, there was a constant, and I set the values equal to a string. So there was pending, I believe, interview declined, but we're just going to go with these 2. So we're going to go with declined, and we'll set it equal also to a string. So I had this enum, and then I was just adding it to, I believe it was the job instance, and I was saving it in the database. Now here's the kicker. When I was saving actually in a database, I was saving it as a string because that was the value for my status pending. And then when I was getting back the value from the database, it was already a string. But I needed to reassign this value to one of the instances. And at that point, TypeScript was complaining because they didn't match. And if this doesn't make any sense, let me just showcase. Let's imagine that we have a user object, and in there I have 2 things. I have name string, and also status is now going to be equal to a type status. So we know that essentially we can use status.pending, status.decline, everything is nice. But since these values are not numbers, we don't have that reverse mapping. So if we'll try to set this value as a string, it's not going to work. So now let me quickly navigate to README. And I just want to grab these 2 comments over here. Again, just so we don't have to type this from the scratch. Imagine this scenario. Now we save status pending in a database, but we save it as a string. So we'll save this value over here. Then we get it back from the database. And now I'm going to go with the status value, and I'll set it equal to the string value of pending. So effectively, this is what I'm getting back from the database. Again, kind of makes sense, correct? Because this is the actual string value. Now, if I'm going to go here and set up my user instance and set it equal to my user type, yep, I typed a name, everything's correct. But if I'm just going to go with the status is equal to a status value, notice how TypeScript immediately complains. Type pending is not assignable to this type. So TypeScript doesn't know that I saved it in the database as a string, so I know for sure that it's the value that's going to match. the constants here in the status. TypeScript doesn't know that. It just says, hey, listen, status here is type status. So you cannot set it equal to a string. And this is where the assertion is useful, where I say, yeah, it is a string, but I know for sure that is type status. So again, type assertion essentially is a way to tell the TypeScript that we know what the type is, that we know more about the type than the TypeScript does. Okay, and up next, let's cover type unknown, which is a type safe counterpart to type any. So just like type any, we can assign any value to type unknown. But the difference is that before we can use the variable with type unknown, we need to perform some type checking, which again avoids the unnecessary runtime errors. So let me go to tutorial, and in here I want to create a variable, and I guess in my case, I'm going to call it unknown value. So that will be my name. And as far as the type, I will set it equal to unknown. So just like with any, I can go here with unknown value, and I can set it up, for example, to be a hello world. So yep, this is allowed. I can also go to a next line and set it equal to, for example, array. That is also allowed. So let me set up my array. I'm going to go with numbers. Okay, good. And then also we can set it up to be a number. So let me go with 42, and then let me add some numbers after the dot. So this is allowed. Now the difference is that I cannot go over here and say unknown value and then set it equal to a fixed. As we can see, TypeScript complains. It says, hey, listen, that type is unknown. And right away, you're running some kind of method. How am I supposed to know that it's actually a number and we can run this particular method? I mean, maybe it's still a string. So the difference, again, unlike type any, before we can use that value, if it's type unknown, we need to check, well, what is the type? So in this case, we can do following operation. I can go type off and then unknown value, and I can check, well, if it's a number, well, then I want to run my method. So let me move this sucker down. And notice now everything works, because in this condition, TypeScript knows that, yeah, unknown value is actually a number. Now, one place where we'll definitely see type unknown is in the try catch block, because by default, TypeScript is going to set this error to be unknown. Now, why do we care about that? Well, what is typically the first thing we do over here? Go here with log, and then error, and then the message. And notice how TypeScript says, well, error is type unknown. So how do you know that there's definitely going to be over here this message property? And this assumption comes from the fact that typically, especially if we're throwing our own errors over here, we use the following code. We go with throw new error and provide whatever message. And in this case, I'm going to go with there was an error. So this is a nice assumption, but please keep in mind that in JavaScript, we can also do something like this. We can go with throw and some string over here. And I know what you're thinking. Well, there's no way I'll do that in a try catch block. Yeah, but you might be running some code from third-party library. And at that point, you don't know whether the error you're going to be getting back is going to be the instance of the error class, or it's going to be something else. Again, it literally can be a simple string. Now, to demonstrate that, I will use somewhat of a silly example where I'm going to set up the function over here. I'm going to go with run some code. So let's imagine that we're saving an image in a database, or I don't know, we're posting some data somewhere, we're sending an email or whatever. And in here, I'm just going to set it equal to a random. Then let's go with math.random. Let's invoke that. And essentially, if it's less than 0.5, then I want to throw a new error. If not, then I'll just throw good old string. So let's set up over here if else, and Let's check for random. If it's less than 0.5, well, then I want to use the sucker. Let me set it up over here. And if not, then I'll just go with throw. And we're going to go with some error. So let me save this. And now in try block, let's go with run some code. And effectively in here, in a catch, we want to check whether the error is the instance of the error class. And if that's the case, yeah, then we'll have access to the message. In this case, there was an error. And if not, well, then we'll simply log and provide some hard-coded error. And this is essentially what you're going to do when you're working with TypeScript. Before you do something with that message, you want to check whether the error you're getting is actually the instance of the error class. So here in the catch block, we want to go with error instance of. We're looking for the error. And then if that's the case, yeah, then TypeScript knows, okay, there is a message property. And here we can go right now with log, and we can set up the error dot message. Now, if it's not the case, since I already have some text, I'll simply log the error. Let me log it. So now let's navigate to the browser and check it out. Depending on that math random, either we're going to get there was an error, or we'll have that string some error. And again, just like any type unknown can be anything, but before we can start using type unknown, we'll have to do some type checking. And therefore, this is a type safe alternative to type any. And up next, let's cover type never, which is a special type that represents the type of values that never occur. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, especially in the beginning. This entire concept might seem pretty confusing, but hopefully after we cover one of the most common use cases of type never, it's going to be easier to grasp the main concept of type never. For starters, let's just establish that if we have a variable with type never, we cannot assign value to it. So let's say if we set up a variable, some value, and if, let's say, it's 0, if I'm going to go with type never, TypeScript is going to complain. And I'm going to get the same result regardless of the value over here. So this can be hello world, this can be an array, doesn't really matter. We cannot assign any value to type never. So that's the first thing we need to remember. Second, you might encounter in your own code type never if you set up one too many conditionals, speaking from the personal experience. So let's say you have a type theme over here, and you set it equal to two possible values. Either it's going to be light or it's going to be dark. Then let's set up a very useful function called check theme. Yes, we'll say that theme parameter is going to be equal to our type of theme. Now we're not going to return anything, so I'm just going to set it equal to void. And then inside of the function, I'm going to set up two conditions. I'm going to go with, well, if theme is equal to, and then I'm going to go with light one. And I'm not going to be particularly original. I'm just going to go with light theme. And then let's return from the function. And we already know that TypeScript is super smart. It knows that at this point, theme can only be value of dark, correct? Because these are the only two options. But let's imagine a scenario where we do add another condition. I'm going to go with if theme is dark. Okay, good. Then I want to log it, but I'll change the value and I'll also return. So let me change this one around. Let me go with dark theme. And notice something interesting. If we type theme after both of these conditions, TypeScript says, hey, listen, theme is type never. Because we have handled all of the possible cases. So at this point in time, there is no possible value for this theme. So if you ever encounter such scenario, you'll have to go back and look at the original value and also all the conditions you're setting up. Because somewhere things are going south. If you are at the point where variable is type never, well, then you already have handled all the possible cases. And what's really awesome, we can actually use it to our advantage. The fact that we cannot assign any values to never, and also the fact that TypeScript will immediately assign type never if we cover all of the possible conditions. As far as our example, we're going to go with enum. I'm going to set it equal to a color. We're going to go with red and blue. So those are two possible values. Now we can assign it to a string, but there's really no need. Then we want to set up a function. In my case, I'm going to go with get color name. As a side note, I'm just going to set up a switch statement where we check for possible values. But if you work with Redux, you'll find this example very similar to how we set up the Redux store. So as far as the type for my parameter, it's going to be a color. And inside of this function, I simply want to go with switch. I want to check for my color, and let's set up our cases. So at this point, we have two of them. So we're going to go with color dot red. So if the color is red, what do we do then? Well, then we want to go with the return red. So let's set up our colon, return, and we're returning the string of red. And if it's blue, well, then let's just change it around. So let me select these two, and let me just go with blue. Then let's set up two console logs, I guess. Let's invoke get color name, and we'll pass in color, then red, and we're going to copy and paste and set up blue as well. And everything's awesome. If we take a look at the console, yep, we have red and blue. But what if sometime later we go to a color and add green? And notice everything's valid. I'm not breaking any rules over here. The problem is going to be here when we invoke it. This is going to fail, but the worst case is actually going to fail silently. So if we navigate right now to the browser, we can see red, blue, and undefined. Why? Well, because we're not handling the case over here. And again, this fails silently. So we set up nicely an additional enum. We correctly pass it in, and then unexpectedly, we're getting an error, correct? And if you're familiar with such code, you're probably screaming at me. You're like, hey, listen, just set up the default case and throw the error. And you're correct. Before TypeScript, that was the approach. So let's go here with default. Then we go with throw, new, error. And for now, let's just take a look at the color. And all of this is nice, but keep in mind, this is again happening at runtime. So yeah, we have this default case where we throw the error if none of the conditions match. But I actually would like to do that while I'm writing the code, not when my application is running. So we can definitely keep this one over here. But a TypeScript approach is to come up with the variable. And I'm going to go with at build time here. And let me add another comment. And in here, I'm going to go with at runtime. And in here, we want to set up another variable. Now, the name is really up to you, but I'm going to go with unexpected color. The type will be equal to a never. And now we'll assign it to the color. And notice how immediately TypeScript complains. Why? Well, because initially we only had two values. So if we go back to this one, everything is correct. I only have this yellow squiggly line, which is totally okay. But if I'm going to add this green one, then right away TypeScript is going to yell at me because now I have one more condition. And of course, we already saw that if we don't handle it over here, then essentially we will throw that error at runtime. So what's the solution? Well, we go with another case. Let's go with color, green, and same deal. Just want to go with return and return a string. In this case, it's going to be a green one. And as you can see, the moment we set up our case, TypeScript doesn't complain anymore. Everything's fine because we have 3 possible enums, and we're handling all of those cases in our get color name as well. So essentially, this is a great benefit for us where we can check for those potential errors at build time instead of just runtime. Okay, and up next, let's switch gears and quickly discuss modules in TypeScript. Now, if you are familiar with how ES6 modules work, most of the things we're about to cover will be a nice review. But when it comes to modules in TypeScript, there are some gotchas we need to be aware of. Let's start with the main one. You see, by default in TypeScript, files are not modules. They're actually treated as scripts in a global scope. So what does that mean? Well, if I go to a source, come up with a name, for example, actions ts, come up with some random variables. One is going to be Susan, then second one is going to be something. So let something is equal to something. If I create another file or in the tutorial try to use the same variable name, I'm not going to be successful. So TypeScript is actually going to complain. So it doesn't treat this file as a module. So whatever I set up in my files is actually put in a global scope, which obviously limits the variables I can use. I have Susan over here, and I also have Susan in the actions, and therefore TypeScript is complaining. So pretty much think of it this way. Everything that you put in the files, by default, again, we'll fix that in a second, but by default, is actually put in a global scope. So in order to fix it, we have 2 options. We can go to tsconfig and essentially set the property, or we can add the export and import. And the moment we add export and import, then they're treated like typical ES6 modules. Now, also, don't be surprised about this gotcha, where, let's say in tutorial, you'll try to come up with the variable with the name of name, and you won't be able to. Even though technically in actions, we don't have this value over here. You see, such name is used in declaration file. Again, something we're going to cover a little bit later. And again, we have this name collision because TypeScript doesn't treat this file as a module. So essentially, unless we change that, there's going to be some keywords that we cannot use. And this was super confusing to me in the beginning because as I started learning TypeScript, I wanted to use this name variable and I got this red squiggly line. And I was like, what's happening over here? Why I cannot use this name one? I mean, there's technically no error. And again, let me repeat for a third time. It's because by default, TypeScript is going to essentially treat the files as just scripts in the global scope. So once we know the issue, how we can fix that, like I said, we have 2 options over here. We can either go to tsconfig and add the property. And you know what? Let me just first showcase how this would work with import and export. If we add export or import statement to our file, immediately TypeScript is going to essentially treat this as a module. So for example, if I'm going to go back to a tutorial, and if I'm going to go with import, and I believe this one was the named export. So we want to go with something from the actions. Everything is awesome. So notice we don't have the issue anymore with the global scope, correct? So now these ones are scoped to tutorial, and then these ones are scoped to the actions. Hopefully that is clear. So this is one approach. Now, what if I don't want to add import and export, like force it in a way? Well, then we can go over here to tsconfig, and we're looking for the property by the name of module detection. And we want to go with force. So by default, it's going to be set to auto, but we want to force it. So in this case, even if there is no export statement, everything is going to work. So notice Now, of course, I have different complaint because I'm importing from the actions and there is no export. But the moment I save, I can use the name, even though it's technically used in declaration file, which was the issue before. And I don't have this name collision with actions anymore as well. So I have Susan over here, and the same is in actions. Again, few approaches. We can either add the property in tsconfig, or if we add import and export, then immediately TypeScript is going to treat it as a module. Okay, and once we're familiar with the main gotcha, let's just see how we can use ES6 modules in TypeScript. And like I mentioned before, if you are familiar with the main concepts, this is just going to be a nice review. Now, before we start typing away, I do want to mention one property in the tsconfig, which is module. And at the moment, notice how we have the value of ES next. Now, this property controls what module syntax is set up in the output code. So effectively, once the TypeScript is done compiling our code. So if I navigate to a playground, notice I have my export statement over here where I'm exporting some function, and this is going to be the result. Now, if I go to tsconfig and change from ES next to, for example, CommonJS, and as a side note, if you're not familiar with CommonJS, it used to be the main module syntax in Node.js, but even Node.js is right now slowly but surely switching to a ES6 module syntax. And notice the moment we change it, actually, this will be the output. So this is a CommonJS syntax. So if you ever have a use case where you want to use different module syntax in the output code, just look for the module property, something I wanted to mention. And now let's just go to actions and set up few values we want to export. And then in tutorial, we will import them. Again, just to have a nice review how the ES6 modules essentially work, just so you can see that pretty much the idea is exactly the same. First, I want to go with some kind of function. I'm going to go with say hello. Let's set up name equal to a string. And you know what? I'll also say that we're not returning anything from this function. In here, we're going to set up a nice console log. We're going to go with hello. And let's access the name. So nothing really groundbreaking. Then let's also export let person is equal to Susan. And let's also set up a new student. So this will be my object, and there's going to be a type for this student. So new student. I don't have the type yet, so let me just type over here Peter and age. Let's set it equal to 24. And you know what? Let's do set up the type because I want to showcase how we can nicely export the type. So for now, let's just go with type student and name is equal to a string. Then age is equal to not string, sorry. I'm going to go with number, and then new student is going to be type student. And now, since I already have two named exports, I just want to showcase how we can do the default one as well. So we're going to go with export default, then new student, and essentially call it a day. So now I want to navigate to tutorial, and one by one, let's grab all of those values. Since I have the default export, I'm going to go with new student, which is coming from the actions. Of course, we can use a different name, but I'm not going to do that. And then for the name ones, we're going to go with say hello, and also we'll set up the person. 1 second. Yep, I want to save. And let me open up the tutorial over here. So these are the things we're importing right now. Let's invoke say hello. We're going to go TypeScript. Okay, good. Then let's log the new student and also a person, just so we can see whether we're getting the correct values. and then we'll talk about the types and how we can export them. So hello TypeScript, I have Peter as well as the Susan. So everything works as we expect. And as far as the types, yes, we can nicely export types as well. So in here, I can go with export, then type student, and then back in tutorial. I have a few options. I can either go here with the student. Notice how I'm getting right away a nice suggestion. Or we can also add over here this type. Again, this doesn't change anything as far as the functionality. It's just a common approach to signal that this is a type we're importing. So this clearly signals to me that, hey, this is a type that I can use in this file. So for example, I can go here with const another student, set it equal to my student type, and let me add different values. So this will be equal to Bob. Let me add an equal sign over here, comma, and we're also going to set up the age of 23. And then if I log another student, we can clearly see that we don't have any TypeScript errors. And then in the console, we should have the correct value. Now, $1,000,000 question. What is the correct quote unquote approach? Should we set up the types in a separate file and then import it, or we keep it in the file where we're actually using the type? And as always, the answer is probably not something you're looking for. It really comes down to your preference. Yes, definitely. You can set up over here a new file, call it types, TS, and then pretty much every time you have a type in your project, set it up in a types and then import in all the files where you're using that value. It's definitely an option. You can definitely do that. And another approach is to keep the type in a file where you initially are using it. And then if you ever have a use case, like in our case in tutorial, you export and then grab it in tutorial. And a common scenario is that you initially just set up the type in the file. And then if you see that you are reusing it all over your project, then yeah, at that point, it kind of makes sense to keep it in one place, since the imports are going to be easier. You won't have to think about, well, where is the actual type located? But again, as always, it really comes down to your preference. All right, and while we're still on the topic of modules, let's also see how TypeScript treats JavaScript files. So remember at the very, very beginning of tutorial, I mentioned that whenever we work with TypeScript, in our case, since we're working with JavaScript files and React files, we need to stick with either .ts extension or tsx extension. And now let's see how TypeScript is going to treat the file if it's just a JS extension. So let's say I'm going to go with source and we're going to create the example JS. And let's go with export, some value that is equal to some value. Everything is awesome. I'm just missing over here the keyword. In this case, I'm going to go with let. And now if we go to tutorial, what do you think is going to happen? How do you think TypeScript is going to treat this file? So let's go with import, some value, and it's coming from, and I don't see essentially it in my suggestions. So I can try to force it. I can say over here example.js, but I'm not going to be successful. So effectively, TypeScript is complaining that it couldn't find the file. Now, the reason for that is because it's not a TypeScript file. So here's the thing about TypeScript. It pretty much needs to know everything about your project. And this is something that we're actually going to come back to when we start working with the third-party libraries in our project. Essentially, when we start using the code that's coming from somewhere else. So as far as TypeScript is concerned, no, we need to set this one up as a TypeScript file. So then it clearly knows well, what is the shape for the data we're getting? Because at the moment, TypeScript is like, hey, I don't know what are you getting over here. I have no info on this sum value. Now we can force it. There's a property we can add in the TypeScript config. Just keep in mind that TypeScript's ability to infer the types, it's not going to be as robust as when we're working with the TypeScript file. So yes, we can navigate right now to tsconfig. We can look for compiler options and we can go with allow.js, and essentially we can set it equal to true. Now we do need to add a comma over here. And now everything magically works in our tutorial. So essentially, TypeScript can infer that some value is actually a string, but just be careful with such approach. Effectively, since we're working on a TypeScript project, yes, we do want to name our files TS, because then TypeScript is going to know that it's a TypeScript file and it's going to have the info on the shape of the data. And if you'll just set up JS file without making any changes to the tsconfig, try to run it, TypeScript will complain. Basically, it's going to say, hey, listen, I'm not sure. What are you exporting? What's happening over here? I'm not okay with this. So let me remove and delete this import as well. And with this in place, now we can move on to the next topic.